It's a familiar song known all over the world. Originally a poem written in English by Jane Taylor over 200 years ago, it was eventually set to an old French folk melody that has also been used for other songs such as the Alphabet Song and Baa Black Sheep, and of course popularized by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in the 18th century. It's a simple tune, one that takes just a few minutes to learn, mainly due to its fairly simple structure. On the page, it just looks like musical notes, but to the trained musician, it is about patterns. The first stanza of the song, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are," is a set of 16 beats, 12 quarter notes, 2 half notes, within 4 measures of music. The second stanza contains exactly the same measurements, but the sounds of the notes are different. The third stanza is again exactly the same measurements, with exactly the same tune as the first stanza. This is called a classic ABA structure, where the first and third stanzas are the same, and the middle stanza is different. It is the musical pattern for over thousands and thousands of songs around the world. Grammatical relationships work much in the same way. At first glance, we see only words on a page. But as we learn more about how they work together, we begin to see not just words, but patterns. Repeated ideas, repeated structures. As we become more experienced in our grammatical knowledge, we begin to understand how the notes of language turn into measures and measures of rhythmic beauty. Sometimes we may strike a bad note, but hopefully in the end, we'll be making sweet music. Welcome to an introduction to grammar. Last time, we compared the rules of grammar to the rules of chess. We said that knowing the individual parts of speech and what they do is a good start, but it's not enough. We have to be able to know how they all interact with each other, and to be able to analyze all of these relationships at any moment. As we learn more about these relationships and ideas, we have to go back and update our knowledge. This week, we're going to build on what we learned in the previous video by expanding and redefining our understanding of verbs, and to recognize their importance in defining clauses. In addition, we're going to expand our understanding of clauses and how they relate to the concept of sentences. Now, throughout this video series, we've been primarily talking about action verbs, but there are other types of verbs that we have in English. As you can see here in our verb profile, verbs do tell not only the action, but also the state of being of the noun, or the subject in this case, in the sentence. So, state of being verbs, which many textbooks also refer to as linking verbs, help to describe the state or condition of a noun. They have to follow some of the same rules of the subject-verb relationship that we've been discussing, but there are some significant differences. So for example, with action verbs tell us what the subject does, is doing, did, has done, or will do. As we know, action verbs can sometimes use an object to receive its action. And action verbs can be modified by adverbs to indicate when, where, why, how, and how long the action is occurring. State of being verbs, on the other hand, tell us how the subject is, or how it looks or seems, how it feels, or how it becomes. It does not use grammatically what we would call an object, but it does need something called a complement, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. And state of being verbs generally cannot be modified by an adverb since adverbs help modify actions, not conditions. So what is a complement? Well, again, a compliment, in this case, it's not referring to the compliment that we get when someone says you look nice. The compliment here is when you have a state of being verb, and the complement is basically going back to describe the noun, in this case the subject itself. In language, there are only two kinds of complements with a state of being verb: adjective complements and noun complements, and both essentially go back to modify the subject. As we can see, this is possible because, as we've discussed before, nouns can be modified by adjectives. So if you notice in the highlighted parts of the profile here, we've updated the information to reflect the fact that we're talking about adjectives as a complement, but also that nouns can serve as a complement to other nouns, or to the subject. So let's demonstrate. So for example, we have here the fox is, which again, is the most common state of being verb, which is in its original form or infinitive form, the to be. So in the singular, it becomes is. So again, the fox is what we start with. But right away we notice that the idea is incomplete. This particular clause, the subject and verb situation, needs something else. So notice in this case, we've added an adjective complement for our first example. So the word brown is going back to modify the word fox. So this is what we call an adjective complement. It's modifying the subject of the clause, but not directly. In other words, we're not saying brown fox, but this is possible. Again, as we noted, adjectives have two possible locations. They usually go either before the noun, or they can also go after a state of being verb. Now we've changed it to a noun. In this case, we've created a noun complement. An animal is reflecting back to the subject, the fox. And it helps to add more information as to what it is. And remember, the article "an" in front of animal would be considered part of the noun. This would be sort of a noun phrase, or a complement phrase, if you will. Recall that anywhere a noun is possible, a noun phrase is also possible. Let's add some more information. So for example, what if we added an article and some more information? So not just an animal, but a very aggressive animal. So notice we did use an adverb here, but remember, adverbs don't work with nouns, but adverbs can modify adjectives. So in this case, we're not saying it's just an aggressive animal, we're saying it's a very aggressive animal. And again, this is possible if you go back to our adverb profile. In the second part of our form of the adverb profile, we did mention that adverbs can modify adjectives and other adverbs. The question is, what type of adverb is it? It's certainly not the same as an adverb of time or location or place. In this case, we call this an adverb of degree. It tells us how much of the quality of something. So for example, it could be very aggressive, or we could substitute with the word a little aggressive. So these types of adverbs are used to describe adjectives and other adverbs. But in this case, this is still a noun complement, because the noun animal is the main idea here. So all of these ideas will form a noun phrase. So in this case, it's serving as the noun complement. So even though we have an adjective, we're not saying the fox is very aggressive. We're saying it's a very aggressive animal. So in this case, this would be considered a noun complement. Now, there are other verbs that function as state of being or linking verbs. Verbs such as seem, appear, become, feel, look, in this case meaning appear, as in she looks fine. Look can also be an action verb, but in this case we're talking about someone's appearance. And of course, the other senses can also be used as state of being verbs, such as smell, taste, or sound, when these things are generally referring to a thing and not a person. So for example, if I said, "This cake smells delicious," we're talking about the cake itself. Obviously, the cake can't smell anything, so we're using it in what we call a state of being way. Now, Believe it or not, some adverbs can be used with state of being verbs, but kind of in a different way. You see, the truth is they don't function the same way as they would with action verbs. Now, if you recall, we mentioned that there are only two choices when it comes to complements. So what happens here is that generally these adverb complements are going to kind of act as adjective complements. Let's look at these examples. In the first example, you'll notice that we have an action verb. And the word tomorrow is describing when the person runs. So in this case, this is an adverb of time. In our second example, though, we have a state of being verb. Now, since the race itself can't run itself, we're using the word tomorrow to actually describe the race. So in this case, the word tomorrow is modifying the actual race. So even though it's generally an adverb, here it's functioning as an adjective. And this does happen using state of being verbs. Now, here's a common problem that students often have when it comes to adverbs of manner. Adverbs of manner work with action verbs because they answer the question, how does he run? Well, in this case, quickly. But notice in our second example, adverbs of manner don't work with state of being verbs. You cannot say the race is quickly because quickly, as it is always an adverb, and in this case you can't say it's a quickly race. So you would actually have to change this adverb to an adjective to make it correct. So watch what happens. This is better, though of course it might be better to say the race is fast. But anyway, adverbs of manner don't work with state of being verbs. So in this case we would have to use an adjective form. So at this point, it's probably good for us to take the particular profile of a verb that we've been studying and throw it away, because now we've actually changed some of the information and made it a little bit more specific to the two types of verbs we have in language. So now we're going to create a new set of profiles using action verbs and state of being verbs. So again, you will find this profile listed at the bottom of this page. But again, in an action verb, we notice most of the things we've already talked about. Action verbs tell us, again, the action of the noun in the sentence. Action verbs need a subject. Sometimes they need an object. So again, if it's a transitive action verb, it needs an object. It can be modified by adverbs, as we've said before. But of course, usually the order is if you have an adverb, the adverb will come after the object. And as we said before, one of the rules or limitations is that, again, a sentence must always contain at least a subject and a verb. Now we've created a new profile for state of being, or linking verbs. In this case, we're describing the state of being of the subject, including how it appears or seems, tastes, smells, sounds, becomes, or how it is. When it comes to its function, we always need a subject to go with the verb, just like you do with action verbs. But state of being verbs always need a complement. So in this case, as we said before, there are two kinds of complements, adjective complements and noun complements. Now, some limitations we've learned is that they cannot work with adverbs of manner, though they can work with adverbs of time and place, which means they will actually function as adjective complements. And of course, remember, some of these words can be action verbs depending on the subject. So, for example, if we're describing how something smells, in other words, part of its characteristic, then we're using it as a state of being verb. But if we're actually following it with an object, then it becomes an action verb. And again, remember, all of the profiles from this presentation will be posted at the bottom of this page. So again, when comparing phrases to clauses, remember that a phrase is just a group of words that interact with each other in some way. So for example, noun phrases or prepositional phrases. Though they satisfy a basic grammatical relationship, as we've said before, they're not complete in the fact that you can use them by themselves and have a complete grammatical idea. That is referring to the concept of a clause. And remember, a clause is basically when you have a subject and verb relationship and all of the other words or phrases that relate to that subject and verb relationship. And as we said before, a sentence needs at least one clause to be considered complete, but it could have more than one, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. So coming back to our old example, one way to redefine this example now is to say that this is one clause. This is because we have one complete subject and verb situation, and that they agree with each other. So again, in this case, we have other ideas in the sentence. Some of these ideas are necessary, and others are unnecessary, but they're possible. So for example, the object, in this case, is necessary because the verb is a transitive verb. Now, since all of the relationships in this clause qualify as logical, and they're in the correct locations, notice now we could redefine this clause to call it one sentence. A sentence is complete when all of the clauses are logical and all of the ideas are in the correct location. Now, in this one clause, or sentence, there are many phrases. Again, we've said there's a subject phrase, a verb phrase, or in this case a phrasal verb, a prepositional phrase which shares the verb, remember it's jumped over, and then we have the object phrase, which in this case the lazy dog is the object of both the verb phrase and the prepositional phrase. The only individual part of speech that's being used by itself is the adverb quickly. And again, it's not necessary for the grammatical completeness of this clause, but it is possible. So of course, if we add it to the sentence, we need to make sure it's logical, and then it goes in the right location, which in this case, remember, objects after a verb will usually come before the adverb of the sentence. So, as we mentioned in the previous video, a clause doesn't have to have a lot of words for it to be grammatically complete. However, once we start to introduce more ideas, so once we start adding more words and phrases, then it becomes more difficult. It becomes a greater challenge to keep all of these relationships clear. A lot, of course, will depend on the nature of what is being added to the clause itself. Now, in this following animated demonstration, watch what happens when we change and or add more ideas to a simple clause. Notice how many different relationships we have to keep in mind as the clause itself becomes more complicated. So in this following demonstration, watch the thought process that happens as we start to think through when we add more ideas to a seemingly simple type of idea. So let's watch what happens. First off, we start with the fox jumped. Now notice the thought process that begins. First off, the noun fox is singular, and it's countable. The word fox needs an article, and this one is definite, so the fox. It's located in front of this verb, which is, again, common, and appears to be the subject because the relationship is logical, and it agrees with the word jumped. Jumped itself, at this moment, appears to be intransitive, so it doesn't look like we need an object at this point. And the verb, we notice, is in the past tense. But now we start to complicate the idea a little bit. Right now it's pretty boring, but all of the relationships do seem complete. This is a complete clause. But now watch what happens once we introduce a new word. You see, now the verb has changed. It's now become a transitive verb, but we're missing the object. Where is it? Aha, there's the object now, the dog. Now it's complete again. So this relationship is once again a complete subject-verb clause. But now we've complicated it again. Now what? We've started the words at the. We'll see this looks like the beginning of a prepositional phrase, but it's missing the object of the phrase. Could it be an adverb? Well, we don't know. The clause is no longer complete. We need more information. Okay, well now we've added a prepositional phrase. It seems complete, but it isn't logical. For example, we say in the morning, not at the morning. It appears to be an adverb of time, but it's still not complete. We need to fix this problem. Okay, we've corrected the prepositional phrase, and now it does appear to be an adverb of time. But now we've added an adjective lazy, and look, it's in the wrong location. Now it's incomplete again. When will this process ever end? So see what happens? As we add more ideas to the clause, we have to keep track of more and more ideas in order to maintain the completeness of the whole thing. So guess what? If something is in the wrong location, or is not logical, which means we have the wrong information or missing information or relationships that don't go together anymore, then the clause is no longer complete. In other words, we have to make sure that every relationship is correct in order to have a balanced clause. So guess what? If one thing is wrong, then the whole clause is wrong. So once again, we said a clause is one subject-verb relationship and all of the other words or phrases that belong to it, that are modifying it. So for example, if the verb is an action verb, that may or may not include an object. If the verb is a state of being verb, that will probably include an adjective complement or a noun complement, which of course are usually more than just one word. So usually it might be an adjective phrase or a noun phrase. Now, as we stated earlier, by definition, a sentence must contain at least one clause, including all of its relationships, provided that the subject and verb relationship is grammatically complete, and all of the other relationships to the clause are also grammatically complete. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but for now we'll assume it to be true. So again, in our example, we stated that this is one clause. Now we can say it's also one sentence. We have also indicated that a sentence is a complete subject-verb relationship, along with all of the other ideas that modify that relationship. And again, we've already identified the various objects and adverbs that all seem to be modifying the ideas in the clause. So, if another way of looking at this clause and sentence idea is to think about how all of the other ideas outside of the subject-verb relationship connect to it. So watch what happens when we choose to reclassify the ideas in the sentence. Now we've created a new term, the predicate. The predicate is just another way to say the verb and all of the other ideas that relate almost exclusively to it. So if you notice in this example, all of the other ideas have some relationship with the verb in the sentence. In fact, you can think of it like this. The predicate is everything else in the clause except for the subject. So notice the brown fox is part of the subject. Everything else belongs to this new relationship or this new term called the predicate. So as we said before, the predicate is just another name for the verb and all of the ideas that relate to it, including any objects or complements, any adverbs that modify the verb, including adverbs of manner, time, place, any prepositional phrases functioning as the types of adverbs mentioned above. By simplifying the name of these relationships, we can more clearly understand now that a sentence must contain at least one grammatically complete subject and predicate relationship. So again, the predicate itself may get more and more complicated. If you remember in our animated demonstration, what was happening is that we were just adding more ideas to the predicate of the sentence. So as the predicate got longer, it became more difficult to keep all of the relationships inside of it straight and complete. So now, since all sentences can be defined at minimum as one subject-predicate relationship, and since the predicate is also by definition flexible, it might be helpful to look at what we have learned so far from a different perspective. So now we will look at the entire sentence instead of just phrases or clauses in order to better understand their patterns of organization. So, before we begin, the basic patterns that we're going to see here are defined from a minimal perspective. So, meaning we have included only what is necessary, not what is possible. Now, you've seen these ideas already throughout the entire video series, but now we're cataloging them here for easier reference and to demonstrate that what is necessary to the predicate idea will depend in large part on what kind of verb we are using. So our first pattern we're going to look at is, again, the simple action verb that's an intransitive pattern. Again, the only things that we absolutely need in this subject and predicate relationship is a subject and an intransitive verb. In our second pattern, in which the predicate includes a transitive verb, remember we always need to have an object. So in this case, the predicate is going to include at least a verb and an object idea. In our third basic pattern, the predicate this time includes a linking verb, but then also includes a complement. And as we said before, there are two kinds of complements: an adjective complement and a noun complement. So again, in beginning to build a profile for a sentence, we're going to first focus on what is necessary. So as we said before, a sentence must contain at least one complete clause, which is a subject or subject phrase, and remember that includes the subject and any ideas that modify it, and a predicate, which includes a verb and any necessary or modifying ideas that go along with that as well. And then any and all of these ideas must satisfy their own grammatical relationships. So again, that's following the concept of logic and, of course, the appropriate location. So, for example, an example of this would be that the subject and verb idea have to agree. Now, we will continue to build on this profile when we start talking about what is possible. We'll discuss that in a couple of minutes. So now, when we move from the basic sentence patterns, we first kind of looked at the fact that sentences contain at least one complete clause, which again we stated was a subject and a predicate. But could a sentence have more than one complete clause? Well, again, starting with our basic example, we said this is a complete clause, which also means that it's a complete sentence. But what would happen if we added another clause to this one? In other words, what if we had two complete sentences that we wanted to join together? So in this case, I've added another sentence that says the brown fox then ran away. Now we have two complete sentences. Now in this case, you'll notice that both have the same subject. So perhaps instead of using two separate sentences, couldn't we just combine them to make one longer sentence? It would seem logical considering they're both related to the same idea. Is that possible? Well, watch what happens. Yes, it is possible. What we added was what was called a coordinating conjunction. And this coordinating conjunction helped us to connect these two complete sentences to create a larger sentence. In other words, a sentence now that has two complete clauses instead of just one. So now let's build a profile of a coordinating conjunction, since this is a new idea for us. On the left side, we talk about the form of these conjunctions. And generally there are 5 common ones, and perhaps you've seen them before. Words such as and, but, or, so, or yet. And then there are 2 that are probably less common for you: nor and for. Now on the right side, when we talk about their function, we recognize that the idea is that coordinating conjunctions will connect 2 or more complete clauses together in the same sentence. And we often use commas to separate the conjunctions in the ideas, especially as the ideas get longer. So if you notice in my example here, he likes hot dogs, comma, and he likes French fries. So commas are often helpful because they help kind of clarify the fact that we had 2 separate ideas together in the same sentence. But really, it's the coordinating conjunction and that really helps us out here. So coordinating conjunctions help connect two or more complete clauses together, meaning that our sentence has now gotten longer. And this is where the word compound, which compound means two, or it could be more, sentence. This is where the word compound comes from. So now we have a sentence with more than one complete subject and predicate, which is, again, certainly very possible. It doesn't matter what kind of subject-predicate idea, just as long as it's complete and that its inclusion in the sentence, of course, is logical. So let's demonstrate here again by talking about what's possible now. So it is possible to add more complete clauses by using a coordinating conjunction. And notice I've used a kind of a mathematical kind of approach here. We have a subject plus a predicate, plus a conjunction, plus another subject, plus another predicate. So let's demonstrate for a moment by substituting some different ideas. And I've color-coded each one to kind of highlight which is the subject, which is the predicate, and of course which is the conjunction, the coordinating conjunction here. So for example, let's try this one. He swims, but she doesn't swim. So in this case, I've coordinated an intransitive action verb clause here, he swims, with another intransitive action verb. And they're kind of logical in a sense because notice on the one hand, one person does this, but on the other, someone else doesn't do that. Now, of course, the key is, could they be two separate sentences? And the answer is yes. You could say he swims, she doesn't swim. But since they seem somewhat related, it made sense to combine them with the word but. Let's try another one. What happens if we make it a little longer? He swims in the morning, but she doesn't swim until the evening. Again, both are intransitive. I've just added a few more words, but in this case, again, it works. And notice I've added a comma here because now our sentence is getting a little longer. Let's change it up a little bit. Now I've made the subject a little bit longer. The intelligent woman is my subject, and then I've added is a teacher, comma, yet she isn't teaching right now. And so, of course, there's the predicate idea for the second part of the sentence. So in this case, in the first part, the first complete clause is a state of being or linking verb situation. I have the word is, and the word teacher is modifying the word woman. But in the second part, I have just another intransitive action verb. So as we said before, it doesn't matter what the subject and predicate really is, as long as it's grammatically complete and somewhat seems logically connected to the second subject and predicate idea. And of course, part of that will be determined by the conjunction that you'll choose to use to separate them. So these coordinating conjunctions are the most common way to link two or more complete clauses together in a sentence. Now, other ways are possible, but for now we're just going to focus on these types of connections. Though it is possible to add more than one complete clause to a sentence, it's generally not a good idea to add too many. Now, as we've progressed here through our video series, and information has gotten a little more difficult and complicated, I think it's always important to say, well, we always need to go back and kind of test ourselves. So as our knowledge continues to grow, we have to try to keep these ideas together. So it's important from time to time to kind of go back and reincorporate information to make sure we're able to remember the ideas we're learning. And of course, possibly identifying any mistakes that we might make along the way. So how can we hear these mistakes? Well, in the next few slides, we'll be looking at a list of sentences. Now, some are going to be basic with just one clause, and some are going to be compound. Each of these sentences will have only one mistake, but that mistake could be involving many different things. For example, it could involve bad logic, which means we have a wrong idea or a missing idea, which could be a word or a phrase. Ideas could be in the wrong location, or perhaps not even possible at all. So our goal is to try to identify the mistake and then think about the rule or idea behind it. This will help us in learning how to see, or rather following our musical idea here, hear the mistakes, and to train us for how we can identify them in the future. Now we're going to start with just an example. As you can see here, I have a sentence on the screen. Now let's see if we can find the mistake. Now, you look at these words and you say, well, where can I begin? It just looks like a bunch of words, right? Well, remember, we've learned lots of relationships so far. So the first thing is to think about what kind of patterns have we already learned? Well, the first question to think about is how many clauses do we have in this sentence? Well, right now, I don't see any conjunctions. So I don't see words like and or yet. So most likely we could say that we have just one clause in this sentence. Now, can we identify the subject and predicate in the sentence? Well, again, the subject is generally the part that we see before the verb, and then the predicate is usually everything else in the clause. So let's try that. So it appears that the subject phrase, the teacher, seems to be the subject, because it does seem to occur before the predicate. And specifically trying to think about, well, we've identified these two ideas, but now we need to continue to break the ideas down further. So for example, can we identify the verb itself, or the verb phrase, and what kind of verb it is? Is it an action verb or a state of being? Well, in this case, it is a verb phrase, and if you've noticed, I've indicated with the letter T that it appears to be a transitive, but let's keep going. Now I put a circle to make it a little bit easier for us to see where the predicate still is. So again, the verb, remember, is part of the predicate idea. Now, it is an action verb because you try to do something. Basically means you're trying it as an action. And it does appear to be a transitive verb because when you try to correct, you generally try to correct something. So in this case, it would answer the question, what did you try to correct? Something. That means it's transitive. So keep in mind, transitive always answers the question, what did you try to do? So that's always important to remember. Okay, let's keep going. So if it is transitive, well, where is the object or object phrase? Well, as we can remember from our profile, generally the object will follow immediately after the verb itself. So in this case, let's assume that the word mistake is the object phrase here of the sentence. So far, things look okay. We've identified all of the grammatical ideas in the sentence. However, we still need to break the ideas down even more. You see, we've identified all the things that are necessary, but of course there are other ideas we can see. This is where most mistakes occur. Most mistakes occur in the smaller ideas of these relationships, not necessarily just in identifying the bigger ideas. Like again, we've identified the subject, we've identified the verb and the object, and so far those particular locations look fine. So generally the mistakes might occur somewhere else. So let's go back and actually look at the subject. Let's try to identify the noun itself. So in this case, we notice that the subject phrase is a combination of the article and the noun. Now, notice the process of questions we're going to ask ourselves. Is this article logical, or is it even necessary? And is it in the right location? Well, so for example, can you say the teacher? Is that possible? Could I take out the word the and just say teacher? Well, again, generally we don't, because first off, teacher is a countable noun. So we'd probably need some kind of article to go with it. Now, could I say a teacher? Yeah, that's possible, but I could also say the teacher. Since it is countable, I would need some kind of article. So in this case, things look pretty good so far. Now let's look at the subject-verb relationship, which remember is the only really necessary relationship we have. Now first off, do they agree? Well, teacher is singular. And this verb, as we notice, is in the past tense. And remember, in the past tense, there usually are no singular plural issues. So in this case, their agreement looks pretty good. Location seems fine. Obviously, the verb usually follows the subject. And can they logically go together? So for example, can a teacher, correct something? And of course, teachers correct things all the time. So that does seem to be logical as well. So far, again, things look pretty good. Now let's look at the object phrase. Where exactly is the noun in this phrase? Well, again, as we break it down, we notice the object phrase, and again, this time we'll keep a circle around it to keep it clear to us. The object phrase itself, again, is a combination of the article and a noun. Now, just like we did before, ask ourselves the same questions. The word mistake. Do I need an article? Well, again, mistake is a countable word. I can have more than one, so in this case, we probably need an article. Now, do I need to say a mistake or the mistake? Again, we don't have enough information, so in this case it is possible. So our article looks fine. Now, what about the actual logic of the situation? Well, again, think about if this is the verb and this is the object of the verb, is it logical to correct a mistake? Well, in this case, it seems logical. And again, objects usually follow the verbs that they are receiving the action from. So again, this relationship seems logical as well. Now, there is one idea in the sentence we haven't identified, and that's the prepositional phrase that we see at the end of this sentence. So let's go ahead and highlight it. Now, as we've talked about before, prepositional phrases are usually not grammatically necessary, but they are usually possible. So in this case, is this one possible? Well, if we're going to ask that question, we need to think about what, in fact, it's actually doing in the sentence. So, what is its function? Well, let's go back to the profile of a preposition for just a moment. As we can see, prepositional phrases can do many things. In this case, it appears that the preposition is telling us something about the location of something. That's a good place to start. Now, if it's giving us a location, does that mean it's functioning as the adverb of place? Well, remember, the adverb, if it in fact is going to function as an adverb, it would have to modify the actual verb, which in this case the verb phrase is talking about correcting something. So, in this process, let's think for just a moment. It seems to be in the right location for an adverb. Remember, objects usually come before adverbs in the sentence. But remember, the basic idea of an adverb of place is to tell us where the action is actually occurring. So in other words, is the teacher doing this action in or at or on this particular place? Well, let's think for just a moment. That doesn't seem to be logical. Part of the problem is the actual phrase is in the board. Can you actually be in a board to do an action? Well, most likely the word board, if you're not really sure, is probably talking about the chalkboard or whiteboard that you might have in a classroom, such as you'll see here in this picture. Notice the teacher is standing here next to the board. But is the teacher actually in the board? Is the teacher correcting the mistake and she is actually located in the board itself? That doesn't seem very possible. Generally, you could say that the teacher is at the board, not in the board. Well, maybe that's the mistake in this sentence? Well, let's keep thinking, because guess what? Prepositional phrases are not always just adverbs. This prepositional phrase could be describing the location of the mistake itself. In other words, it could be modifying the word mistake, not just telling us where the teacher actually corrected the mistake. So this would mean that the prepositional phrase is functioning more like an adjective, which, believe it or not, is possible. So in other words, we're talking about a mistake that is somewhere around the board. Not that the teacher corrected it in the board, but that the mistake is located here. So of course now the next question is it logical for a mistake to be in the board? In this case, again, the answer is no. So if the prepositional phrase is describing the teacher's location, which already we said you can't correct something and be in the board, that's not logical. But if it's modifying the word mistake as an adjective, it also is incorrect because a mistake is not in the board. Well, in this case, I feel pretty confident that we found the mistake. You see, if we use it as an adverb of place, we would have to say that the teacher corrected the mistake at the board. In other words, you're modifying where the teacher corrected, or where the teacher was located. But if you say on the board, which is what we say in English, is that you write on a chalkboard, then if you're using it as an adjective, still the word in would be wrong. Now, that was a lot of work. Sometimes it's going to take that amount of work to find where we make our mistakes. But I do want you to notice the order that we followed in order to find this, to kind of come to the solution. We started in a very logical and systematic way. We started with trying to identify how many clauses the sentence has. So for example, do you see a coordinating conjunction? More than one subject or predicate relationship? Maybe the mistake is there. Can you identify the subject predicate of each clause if there's more than one? And if the verb is an action verb or a state of being or linking verb? Remember, if it's an action verb, is it transitive or intransitive? If it's a state of being verb, where is the complement? Next, try to focus on the actual subject-verb relationship. Do they agree? Are they logical? Are they in the correct locations in relation to each other? Then begin systematically identifying all of the phrases that function in this subject-predicate relationship. Now, I have a very good hint, and that hint that I would tell you is try to find the prepositional phrases first. Prepositional phrases are very tricky, and generally they serve two purposes. They're either describing where the action is occurring, or they're actually directly modifying the location or relationship, physical relationship often, of a particular object. So in this case, they could be generally functioning as an adverb or as an adjective. So prepositional phrases can be occurring in many places in a sentence. So notice we've added some information to our profile. They can function like adverbs, but they can also function like adjectives. So other phrases to look at, again, the subject phrase, if there is one, the verb phrase, if there is one. If the verb has if the verb's transitive, does it have an object phrase? Is there a complement or a complement phrase if the verb is a state of being or linking verb? And are there any adverb phrases? And of course, that could also include prepositional phrases, as we mentioned before. So notice, as we went along each step of the way, we asked these questions. Are these relationships necessary or possible? Are these relationships logical? In other words, do they make sense together? Are they in the correct location to each other? These particular questions are very helpful to ask as we go along. So now let's begin the test. And you will see these sentences located at the bottom of this page. So I have listed here 5 incorrect sentences. And remember, there is only one mistake in each one, but that mistake could be almost anything. So take a look at these particular 5 sentences and try to correct them. Again, you can pause the screen if you like to look at these sentences, or you can look at the information below this page. The answers will actually be revealed in the second part of this video series. So in our next video, we will continue to build on our knowledge of sentences and continuing to review the ideas of basic and compound sentences, and then finally we're going to introduce one more type of sentence. We will also add a new type of clause to our discussion, along with a new type of conjunction. So again, we're going to learn some more new information in the next part. And then we will reveal and explain the answers to our first ear training test, and then probably take another test before we're finished. So we'll see you next time for Understanding the Tune, Part 2. Thanks for watching.